I think if we look at surveys of the American people, they're not always in line with decisions that are being made, not supportive of decisions that are being made. And so again, if this is a democracy, a voice of the people, decisions that are being made from a constitutional standpoint should also reflect what the voice of the people is. And maybe it's just this perfect storm, and maybe everything is just coming together at the same time, but it sure makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, as long as you don't yield to fear, you are uncomfortable, you're scared.
Okay, I'm scared.
You're scared because of all these things, but recognize that it's a perfect storm.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Dr. Nelson, as always, a pleasure to be chatting with you. How is your world? What's on your mind? What's cooking?
Not much, but it is a pleasure to be here. Of course, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the support of Nationwide. So I'd like to acknowledge their support. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Well, when we're recording this, it's Independence Day weekend. It's a 4-day weekend for some. For others, we just kind of work through it like it's another weekend. But yeah, we're here because of the fact that we have independence. Well, we've had independence for 246 years now. At least I have. But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been going on in the world too. So, but never a dull moment in the United States these days, is it?
Well, there's never been a dull moment in the United States anyway. There's always something. That's what makes it such a robust country. But if you're referring to some of the recent developments and the overall trends, retroaction within the country, despite your particular views, yeah, it's unusually troubling and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When we started these podcasts 2 years ago, I commented that I felt we were going backwards, at least from a racial standpoint, because it was post George Floyd and everything that was going on there. But we're going backwards in a lot of other ways based upon rulings that have come down and other things that are around us. So are we really heading in the right direction?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that it's always a struggle, and moving societies forward is never a linear process. And what we cannot do is become so demoralized by a lack of advance or a seemingly retreat to darker days or darker views. We can't become so demoralized that we cease to struggle. The struggle lasts as long as the struggler remains active. I think that's important. But at the same time, I think I want to be very careful and say that part of this courageous conversation is providing respect for those who differ with your position, and not to demonize the position or the intent of the position. I believe it's important that we discuss objectively the consequences of certain positions, and that we continue to debate and struggle with the balance of competing rights. But the issues that we're dealing with that seem to be on the table today, Roe V Wade, the rights of a woman to determine their own healthcare versus the rights of the unborn versus the protection of life itself, and the issues of determining the importance of life. For me, all of those things are intertwined, and all of those things require a much more in-depth analysis than what I'm hearing. I abhor absolutism. I abhor the inability to fractionate an issue because of the fear of the tension that it causes. But veterinarians and healthcare givers make life and death decisions every day. And quality of life is an important aspect of those decisions. It's an important factor in those decisions. I also abhor condescending solutions as well. On the gun issue, it is more than irony to me that suddenly mental health becomes a fundable issue as long as you don't take away our guns.
You know, what bothers me, I think all of the individual issues, Roe v. Wade, guns, election control, is the politicization of the judicial body, Supreme Court, that I don't believe ever was the intent when it was created in the Constitution. And what at least it feels like is these are decisions that have been made based upon politics versus principle. And that's just, I don't believe that was the intent of the founding fathers. And I was listening to one of the TV networks last night that talked about the Supreme Court 30 plus years ago, I believe, that either approved or ratified Roe v. Wade, that basically was 5 Supreme Court justices that had been appointed by Republican presidents. We now have 6 Republican justices that have undone what their brethren did in the past. There's so much, but this chasm that continues to exist between people on either side of the aisle, and now extends into the Supreme Court, and has even more so extended into the lives that we lead, and just being careful about what you say and to whom you say it, and in social media, at a restaurant, or waiting online someplace. I wasn't sure if it was you or somebody else that basically said, I mean, we're really on the edge of a civil war with some of the issues that are going on right now. That's the thing that makes me so uncomfortable.
That was a very graphic statement that you just made. You touched on so many issues, that at least 6 issues, each of which could occupy an entire conversation for us. And all of them are important. I agree with everything that you said. The last thing you said is the greatest threat for me, and that is the development of the thought police.
Mm-hmm.
Of all the rights that we have, freedom of thinking is the most important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, freedom of expression is the most important. And I believe that is the existential threat to our Constitution and to our democracy. When a party can tamper with witnesses, when a party can excoriate a person for doing their job, when a party can threaten the livelihood of a person who happens to disagree with a potential plank in the platform, or who believes that an individual in the party may have misbehaved criminally and acts as a conscientious citizen and is publicly punished for that.
Mm-hmm.
Those are symptoms of thought police. And that's how you create dictators and autocratic government that's ruled by one party. And when that same party uses underhanded legislative tactics to control the Supreme Court, I am not one to agree to pat descriptions of an organization as austere as Supreme Court justices are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to agree with you that there is a political element in many of these Supreme Court decisions that are coming down now. But I don't blame the Republican presidents that appointed these people. You have to remember, the Republican presidents suggest their appointments, and they are supposed to be approved by vetting process in the Senate.
Right.
And that process was broken a long time ago. And that is where politics was introduced. Many of these justices should not have survived the process, regardless of their political position, because they weren't ready. One of the common phrases I keep hearing when we talk about diversity is, we don't want to lower our standards. We may have to lower our standards to get a diverse class. And yet we don't mind lowering our standards to achieve a focused decision in the Supreme Court. We needed people who were so myopic that they could ignore the Constitution to make a decision that was amenable to the social views of a certain demographic. And yet there is no way that some of the more recent appointees to the Supreme Court compare to the qualification of their predecessors. Now, let me be clear. The Supreme Court has not always been impervious to politics. A segregation was approved by the Supreme Court for a long time.
Dred Scott.
Dred Scott. So we have had courts that have ignored the intent of the Constitution before. I'm just embarrassed that one of them happens to be somebody who should understand more than anybody the intent of the 14th Amendment.
Maybe I'm older and more sensitive. Maybe I'm just more aware. Maybe it's really getting worse. And of course, you throw an economic environment that's very unstable from an inflationary standpoint, from a thought of the threat of a recession, and still the ongoing issues with the pandemic. And you've got all of these things coming together that need to be talked about. They need to be talked about amongst people, between people, but in a cordial fashion and not in a confrontational fashion, but just a willingness to listen and learn. And I think if we look at surveys of the American people, they're not always in line with decisions that are being made, not supportive of decisions that are being made. And so again, if this is a democracy, a voice of the people, decisions that are being made from a constitutional standpoint should also reflect what the voice of the people is. Maybe it's just this perfect storm, and maybe everything is just coming together at the same time, but it sure makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, as long as you don't yield to fear. You are uncomfortable, you're scared.
Okay, I'm scared.
You're scared because of all these things, but recognize that it's a perfect storm. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Right.
You don't sit in the middle of a storm and just cover yourself up and say, woe is me. You find shelter from the storm, and then you try to figure out how you're going to thrive until the storm is over.
Right.
And if there's anything you can do about the storm, you do it. If your house is leaking, you fix the leaks. But you don't just sit around and pile on your troubles and then blame somebody for it. Yes, these are some heady times, but it's not as if we haven't been through them before. Just as when we went through the pandemic, we kept saying, this isn't the first time we've been through a pandemic. That history helped us get through it. Now, on top of the pandemic comes Ukraine, and on top of Ukraine comes inflation. And on top of that comes the problems with delivery chain of goods.
Supply chain.
And on top of that, we get inflation. Well, we've been in inflationary periods before, and everybody knew that we were going to have inflation again. I don't think any economist thought we had licked inflation for good. And so to sit here and blame Biden for it is just ludicrous. Once again, there is no one person. There are contributors, but part of the reason that inflation is raging is because China is still dealing with the pandemic. They haven't come out. And we're now seeing what a global economy looks like. If China was supplying the world so that they could feed their billions of citizens, but now they have them under lockdown to keep them safe, the world suffers. And one of the things we learned was that we were so dependent on the global economy and just-in-time delivery. I wonder how that's going to survive now. I predict that we might have a resurgence of warehouses.
Amazon Prime is not Prime anymore.
What?
Amazon Prime is not on time anymore.
Yeah. Well, I got a feeling that we're going to start building surplus supplies just so we can be on time and get the goods we need when we need it. We didn't even have masks. We couldn't even supply our medical caregivers with masks because they were coming from China.
I got to digress for just a second because talking about hoarding, it was toilet paper during COVID. After Supreme Court Justice Thomas's comment about Roe v. Wade and birth control, apparently there's been a hoarding of condoms, and so they're limiting the number of condoms you can purchase on Amazon. This is the sort of insanity that, and I think a lot of it, and we've talked about this over time, I think of it is it's a 24/7, 365 news cycle. When you and I grew up and we watched the news at 6, It ended at 6:30 or 7. And maybe we read it in the newspaper the next day, but it wasn't a 24/7, 365 news cycle. I think we are so bombarded with information, some of it edited, some of it not, that it just adds to the anxiety that we all have. Maybe I shouldn't say we, that I have, because you ingest this and it's just disruptive to your normal brain cells. It says, well, there's going to be a shortage of condoms. It's like, oh Christ, that was the last thing I ever thought we'd run out of.
Well, all that means is that we have to self-police.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody makes you sit in front of a TV 24/7.
Yeah.
And listen to news. There are other channels that you could listen to. On the other hand, you can provide the same discipline to news gathering and TV watching.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday when I got home from my travel, and I hate flying now, by the way, I'd rather go by train. They added billions of dollars in their coffers just to charge for luggage. But now it's not only expensive to fly, but it's unreliable.
Yeah, it's inefficient.
Whether it's inefficient, it's just unreliable.
Right.
Every flight I've taken in the last month has been delayed. Somewhere in my itinerary, going and coming, I've gotten to my destination late. Why am I paying more for that? But on the other hand, if I want to drive, that's expensive too, until my electric car shows up. And even that's becoming expensive because of inflation. I can sit here and say, woe is me. Everywhere I turn, it gets worse, right? Or yeah. I can police myself and become resilient and realize that this too shall pass.
The point is, I try to filter as much as I can and limit my exposure as much as I can. But man, the short exposure times,
it doesn't make the problems any less serious.
Right. Yeah. And I do think having these conversations with you sometimes brings me down, talks me down off the cliff. Sometimes it makes me want to jump off a cliff.
Yes, and believe me, I get there too. I am not always the sage, wizened old man that I sound sometimes. I mean, I see that as a good thing. It says you care.
Yeah.
It says that you really do care about your future and the future of others.
Yeah.
But the decisions need to be made based on values. And again, I accept that there are differing legitimate positions on abortion. I don't think anybody is pro-abortion. I hate that phrase. It is not pro-life and pro-abortion. It is, both issues are pro-life. It's about which life are we talking about. We're trying to balance the rights of the life of the mother and the child. And people use extremes in order to make their case for one or the other. And when I say extremes, we talk about the extremes are either rape and incest on the one hand. Are you going to force someone to have a child in those instances? Or the seemingly lack of moral fortitude on the other, where people see getting an abortion like taking an aspirin because it's safe. Either of those are extreme, when the real tension here is about life. And when you make that value judgment, the decisions that are available to you after you've made that value judgment. And who should make that value judgment? Should it be made by the woman herself, or the partnership that woman has? Or should it be made by the state? Or should it be made by the state by reducing your options?
Well, it's obvious that there is no one answer, because no two states have the same answer to the question. Some say 6 weeks, some say 8 weeks, some say 12, some say 24, some say none at all. I mean, there is no consistency in this discussion. It's really confusing to the—
And you're not going to get any consistency. It is confusing. You're asking for apple pie here, and you're not going to get it. It's a tough decision. The decisions are going to be different. They should be different. The fact that the states are even stepping in at all is a problem, because it's going to be different at each presentation.
Yeah.
And we have to accept that. just as you accept that a case of distemper looks different and you're going to treat it differently based on the time the disease is presented to you and the condition of the animal before the animal got the disease and the drugs you have available, et cetera, all those things play a part in the decision. Even though I'm troubled by the reversal of Roe v. Wade, I'm not as demoralized as others because the decision was there's no constitutional right to an abortion. It wasn't that abortion is illegal. It was that there's no constitutional right. Now, I'm willing to continue to argue that point and discuss that, but it just puts the battles back into the state.
Which takes us back to the Civil War, because wasn't the Civil War over states' rights?
No, yes, it was, but this doesn't take us back to the Civil War because they're recognizing the states have the right. Right. The war was about the fact that the right to slavery should be decided by states.
Right.
Which is a very good point that you probably should have made. And that is, if the states can't decide whether or not you can wrongfully imprison a person just because of their race, that is a human right, then again, it raises the bar again. And that's why I disagree with making these decisions by states.
Well, that was what I was hinting at without saying it when I asked the question about states' rights. It's like, we can't figure out who gets to make these decisions. It's like, we don't want to do it, you do it. Well, maybe we can't do it, so you do it. It's like, just adds to a global confusion. Now, of course, if you have one big country like China or Russia, where the government makes all the decisions, then you worry about that as well. So it's an interesting time. And I do think it's a time when people should be having conversations comfortably without threats of repercussions with people who differ.
But clearly we haven't worked it out yet. And again, as I said, we're talking about life.
Yep.
And those that are passionate about protecting the unborn, I wish they were just as passionate about protecting the born.
It's an uncomfortable situation for me.
It's uncomfortable for all of us.
Yeah.
I sound as if I'm more comfortable with the discomfort.
Yes, you are more comfortable with the discomfort than I am.
But that's because I start with recognizing the genuineness of most of their opinions, regardless what side they're on. I do believe that most of us have been distracted by myopic extremist views, and we are not discussing the real issue here. Because if we did, we would recognize there is no law that's going to placate everybody. Right.
Can't make 330 million people happy.
I'm not trying. No, it's more than that. That's such a simplistic term. I'm not trying to make anybody happy. Okay. What I'm trying to do is provide a basis by which we can come up with a process that says, I don't like the consequences either way. But when we're faced with this dilemma, here's how we are going to make those decisions.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.